All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, to return voyage, I assure you that your boat, which is here on exhibition, shall be put in the waters of the river Hiddekel at its mouth, and we will bid you Jehovah's speed. Thus terminated our only interview with the high priest, ruler of the continent. End of part 3.
Who's Christian?
Recording by Jay Sands.
Actually, I'm running his agency.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Part 4 of The Smoky God. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jay Sands. The Smoky God, or Voyage to the Inner World, by Willis George Emerson. In the underworld, we learn that the males do not marry before they are from 75 to 100 years old, and that the age at which women enter wedlock is only a little less, and that both men and women frequently live to be from 600 to 800 years old, and in some instances much older. Note 18. Josephus says, quote, God prolonged the life of the patriarchs that preceded the deluge, both on account of their virtues and to give them the opportunity of perfecting the sciences of geometry and astronomy, which they had discovered, which they could not have done had they not lived 600 years, because it is only after the lapse of 600 years that the great year is accomplished, unquote. Flammarion, Astronomical Myths, Paris, page 26. During the following year, we visited many villages and towns, prominent among them being the cities of Niji, Delphi, Hectia, and my father was called upon no less than a half a dozen times to go over the maps which had been made from the rough sketches he had originally given of the divisions of land and water on the outside surface of the earth. I remember hearing my father remark that the giant race of people in the land of the Smoky God had almost an accurate idea of the geography of the outside surface of the earth, as had the average college professor in Stockholm. In our travels, we came to a forest of gigantic trees near the city of Delphi. Had the Bible said there were trees towering over 300 feet in height and more than 30 feet in diameter, growing in the Garden of Eden? The Ingersolls, the Tom Paines, and the Voltaires would doubtless have pronounced the statement a myth. Yet, this is the description of the California Sequoia gigantea. But these California giants pale into insignificance when compared with the forest Goliaths found in the within continent, where abound mighty trees from 800 to 1,000 feet in height and from 100 to 120 feet in diameter. Countless numbers and forming forests extending hundreds of miles back from the sea. The people are exceedingly musical and learned to a remarkable degree in their arts and sciences, especially geometry and astronomy. Their cities are equipped with vast palaces of music, where not infrequently as many as 25,000 lusty voices of this giant race swell forth in mighty choruses of the most sublime symphonies. The children are not supposed to attend institutions of learning before they are 20 years old. Then their school life begins and continues for 30 years, 10 of which are uniformly devoted by both sexes to the study of music. Their principal vocations are architecture, agriculture, horticulture, the raising of vast herds of cattle, and the building of conveyances peculiar to that country for travel on land and water. By some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country on air currents. All buildings are erected with special regard to strength, durability, beauty, and symmetry, and with a style of architecture vastly more attractive to the eye than any I have ever observed elsewhere. About 3/4 of the inner surface of the earth is land, and about 1/4 water. There are numerous rivers of tremendous size, some flowing in a northerly direction, and others southerly. Some of these rivers are 35 miles in width, and it is out of these vast waterways at the extreme northern and southern parts of the inside surface of the earth, in regions where low temperatures are experienced, that freshwater icebergs are formed. They are then pushed out to sea like huge tongues of ice by the abnormal freshets of turbulent waters that, twice every year, sweep everything before them. We saw innumerable specimens of bird life no larger than those encountered in the forests of Europe or America. It is well known that during the last few years, whole species of birds have quit the earth. A writer in a recent article on this subject says, note 19, quote, almost every year sees the final extinction of one or more bird species. Out of 14 varieties of birds found a century since on a single island, the West Indian island of St. Thomas, 8 have now to be numbered among the missing. Unquote. Is it not possible that these disappearing bird species quit their habitation without and find an asylum in the within world? Whether inland among the mountains or along the seashore, we found bird life prolific. When they spread their great wings, some of the birds appeared to measure 30 feet from tip to tip. They are of great variety and many colors. We were permitted to climb up on the edge of a rock and examine a nest of eggs. There were 5 in the nest, each of which was at least 2 feet in length and 15 inches in diameter. After we had been in the city of Ateka about a week, Professor Chaldea took us to an inlet where we saw thousands of tortoises along the sandy shore. I hesitate to state the size of these great creatures. They were from 25 to 35 feet in length, from 15 to 20 feet in width, and fully 7 feet in height. When one of them protected its head, it had the appearance of some hideous sea monster. The strange conditions within are favorable not only for vast meadows of luxuriant grasses, forests of giant trees, and all manner of vegetable life, but wonderful animal life as well. One day we saw a great herd of elephants. There must have been 500 of these thunder-throated monsters with their restlessly waving trunks. They were tearing huge boughs from the trees and trampling smaller growth into dust like so much hazel brush. They would average over 100 feet in length and from 75 to 85 in height. It seemed, as I gazed upon this wonderful herd of giant elephants, that I was again living in the public library in Stockholm, where I had spent much time studying the wonders of the Miocene age. I was filled with mute astonishment, and my father was speechless with awe. He held my arm with a protecting grip, as if fearful harm would overtake us. We were 2 atoms in this great forest, and, fortunately, unobserved by this vast herd of elephants as they drifted on and away, following a leader as does a herd of sheep. They browsed from growing herbage which they encountered as they traveled, and now and again shook the firmament with their deep bellowing. Note 20, quote, moreover, there were a giant number of elephants in the island, and there was provision for animals of every kind. Also, whatever fragrant things there are in the earth, whether roots or herbage, or woods, or distilling drops of flower or fruits, grew and thrived in that land. Unquote. The Cratylus of Plato. There is a hazy mist that goes up from the land each evening, and it invariably rains once every 24 hours. This great moisture and the invigorating electrical light and warmth account perhaps for the luxuriant vegetation, while the highly charged electrical air and the evenness of climatic conditions may have much to do with the giant growth and longevity of all animal life. In places, the level valleys stretched away for many miles in every direction. The smoky god, in its clear white light, looked calmly down. There was an intoxication in electrically surcharged air that fanned the creek as softly as a vanishing whisper. Nature chanted a lullaby in the faint murmur of winds, whose breath was sweet with the fragrance of bud and blossom. After having spent considerably more than a year in visiting several of the many cities of the within world and a great deal of intervening country, and more than 2 years had passed from the time we had been picked up by the great excursion ship on the river, we decided to cast our fortunes once more upon the sea and endeavor to regain the outside surface of the earth. We made known our wishes, and they were reluctantly but promptly followed. Our hosts gave my father, at his request, various maps showing the entire inside surface of the earth, its cities, oceans, seas, rivers, gulfs, and bays. They also generously offered to give us all the bags of gold nuggets, some of them as large as a goose's egg, that we're willing to attempt to take with us in our little fishing boat. In due time, we returned to Jehu, at which place we spent 1 month in fixing up and overhauling our little fishing sloop. After all was in readiness, the same ship, Naz, that originally discovered us, took us on board and sailed to the mouth of the river Hedder. After our giant brothers had launched our little craft for us, they were most cordially regretful at parting, and evinced much solitude for our safety. My father swore by the gods Odin and Thor that we would surely return again within a year or two and pay them another visit. And thus, we bade them adieu. We made ready and hoisted our sail, but there was little breeze. We were becalmed within an hour after our giant friends had left us and started on their return trip. The winds were constantly blowing south. That is, they were blowing from the northern opening of the earth toward that which we knew to be south, but which, according to our compass's pointing finger, was directly north. For 3 days we tried to sail, and to beat against the wind, but to no avail. Whereupon my father said, "My son, to return by the same route as we came in is impossible at this time of year. I wonder why we did not think of this before. We have been here almost 2.5 years. Therefore, this is the season when the sun is beginning to shine in at the southern opening of the earth. The long cold night is on the Spitzbergen country." Unquote. "What shall we do?" I inquired. "There is only one thing we can do," my father replied, "and that is to go south." Accordingly, he turned the craft about, gave it full reef, and started by the compass north, but, in fact, directly south. The wind was strong, and we seemed to have struck a current that was running with a remarkable swiftness in the same direction. In just 40 days, we arrived at Delphi, a city we had visited in company with our guides, Jules, Galti, and his wife, near the mouth of the Gahan River. Here, we stopped for 2 days and were most hospitably entertained by the same people who had welcomed us on our former visit. We laid in some additional provisions and again set sail, following the needle due north. On our outward trip, we came through a narrow channel which appeared to be a separating body of water between two considerable bodies of land. There was a beautiful beach to our right, and we decided to reconnoiter. Casting anchor, we waded ashore to rest up for a day before continuing the outward hazardous undertaking. We built a fire and threw on some sticks of dry driftwood. While my father was walking along the shore, I prepared a tempting repast from supplies we had provided. There was a mild, luminous light which my father said resulted from the sun shining in from the south aperture of the earth. That night, we slept soundly and awakened the next morning as refreshed as if we had been in our own beds at Stockholm. After breakfast, we started out on an inland tour of discovery, but had not gone far when we sighted some birds, which we recognized at once as belonging to the penguin family. They were flightless birds, but excellent swimmers and tremendous in size, with white breasts, short wings, black head, and long, peaked bills. They stand fully 9 feet high. They looked at us with little surprise and perceptibly waddled rather than walked toward the water and swam away in a northerly direction. Note 21, quote, "The nights are never so dark at the poles as in other regions, for the moon and stars seem to possess twice as much light and effulgence. In addition, there is a continuous light, the varied shades of play of which are amongst the strongest phenomena of nature." Unquote. Brassen's astronomy. The events that occurred during the following 100 or more days beggar description. We were on an open and iceless sea. The month we reckoned to be November or December, and we knew the so-called South Pole was turned toward the sun. Therefore, when passing out and away from the internal electric light of the smoky god and its genial warmth, we would be met by the light and warmth of the sun, shining in through the south opening of the earth. We were not mistaken. Note 22. Quote, "The fact that gives the phenomenon of the polar aurora its greatest importance is that the earth becomes self-luminous. That, besides the light, which the planet is received from the central body, shows a capability of sustaining a luminous process proper to itself," unquote. Humboldt. There were times when our little craft, driven by wind that was continuous and persistent, shot through the waters like an arrow. Indeed, had we encountered a hidden rock or obstacle, our little vessel would have been crushed into kindling wood. At last, we were conscious that the atmosphere was growing decidedly colder, and a few days later, icebergs were sighted far to the left. My father argued, and correctly, that the winds which filled our sails came from the warm climate within. The time of the year was certainly most auspicious for us to make our dash for the outside world and attempt to scud our fishing sloop through open channels of the frozen zone which surrounds the polar region. We were soon amid the ice packs, and how our little craft got through the narrow channels and escaped being crushed, I know not. The compass behaved in the same drunken and unreliable fashion in passing over the southern curve or edge of the Earth's shell as it had done on our inbound trip at the northern entrance. It gyrated, dipped, and seemed like a thing possessed. Note 23. Captain Sabine on page 105 in quote, "Voyages in the Arctic Regions," unquote, says, quote, "The geographical determination of the direction and intensity of the magnetic forces at different points of the Earth's surface has been regarded as an object worthy of special research. To examine in different parts of the globe the declination, inclination, and intensity of the magnetic force, and their periodical and secular variations, and mutual relations and dependencies could be duly investigated only in fixed magnetical observatories," unquote. One day, as I was lazily looking over the sloop's side into the clear waters, my father shouted, "Breakers ahead!" Looking up, I saw through a lifting mist a white object that towered several hundred feet high, completely shutting off our advance. We lowered sail immediately, and none too soon. In a moment, we found ourselves wedged between two monstrous icebergs. Each was crowding and grinding against its fellow mountain of ice. They were like two gods of war, contending for supremacy. We were greatly alarmed. Indeed, we were between the lines of a battle royale. The sonorous thunder of this grinding ice was like the continued volleys of artillery. Blocks of ice, larger than a house, were frequently lifted up 100 feet by the mighty force of lateral pressure. They would shudder and rock to and fro for a few seconds, then come crashing down with a deafening roar and disappear in the foaming waters. Thus, for more than 2 hours, the contest of the icy giants continued. It seems as if the end had come. The ice pressure was terrific, and while we were not caught in the dangerous part of the jam and were safe for the time being, yet the heaving and rending of tons of ice as it fell, splashing here and there into the watery depths, filled us with shaking fear. Finally, To our great joy, the grinding of the ice ceased, and within a few hours the great mass slowly divided, and, as if an act of providence had been performed, right before us lay an open channel. Should we venture with our little craft into this opening? If the pressure came on again, our little sloop, as well as ourselves, would be crushed into nothingness. We decided to take the chance, and accordingly hoisted our sail to a favoring breeze, and soon started out like a racehorse running the gauntlet of this unknown narrow channel of open water. End of part 4. Recorded by J. Sands. Part 5 of The Smoky God. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Sands. The Smoky God, or Voyage to the Inner World, by Willis George Emerson. Among the ice packs. For the next 45 days, our time was employed in dodging icebergs and hunting channels. Indeed, had we not been favored with a strong south wind and a small boat, I doubt if this story could have ever been given to the world. At last, there came a morning when my father said, "My son, I think we are to see home. We are almost through the ice. See, the open water lies before us." However, there were a few icebergs that had floated far northward into the open water, still ahead of us on either side, stretching away for many miles. Directly in front of us, and by the compass, which had now righted itself due north, there was an open sea. "What a wonderful story we have to tell to the people of Stockholm," continued my father, while a look of pardonable elation lighted up his honest face. "And think of the gold nuggets stowed away in the hold." I spoke kind words of praise to my father, not alone for his fortitude and endurance, but also for his courageous daring as a discoverer, and for having made the voyage that now promised a successful end. I was grateful, too, that he had gathered the wealth of gold we were carrying home. While congratulating ourselves on the goodly supply of provisions and water we still had on hand, and on the dangers we had escaped, we were startled by hearing a most terrific explosion caused by the tearing apart of a huge mountain of ice. It was a defending roar like the firing of 1,000 cannon. We were sailing at the time with great speed, and happened to be near a monstrous iceberg, which, to all appearances, was as immovable as a rock-bound island. It seemed, however, that the iceberg had split and was breaking apart, whereupon the balance of the monster along which we were sailing was destroyed, and it began dipping from us. My father quickly anticipated the danger before I realized its awful possibilities. The iceberg extended down into the water many hundreds of feet, and, as it tipped over, the portion coming out of the water caught our fishing craft like a fever on a fulcrum, and threw it into the air as if it had been a football. Our boat fell back on the iceberg that, by this time, had changed the side next to us for the top. My father was still in the boat, having become entangled in the rigging, while I was thrown some 20 feet away. I quickly scrambled to my feet and shouted to my father, who answered, "All is well." Just then, a realization dawned upon me. Horror upon horror. The blood froze in my veins. The iceberg was still in motion, and its great weight and force in toppling over could cause it to submerge temporarily. I fully realized what a sucking maelstrom it would produce amid the worlds of water on every side. They would rush into the depression in all their fury, like white-fanged wolves eager for human prey. In this supreme moment of mental anguish, I remember glancing at our boat, which was lying on its side, and wondering if it could possibly right itself, and if my father could escape. Was this the end of our struggles and adventures? Was this death? All these questions flashed through my mind in the fraction of a second, and a moment later I was engaged in a life and death struggle. The ponderous monolith of ice sank below the surface, and the frigid waters gurgled around me in frenzied anger. I was in a saucer with the waters pouring in on every side. A moment more, and I lost consciousness. When I partially recovered my senses and roused from the swoon of a half-drowned man, I found myself wet, stiff, and almost frozen, lying on the iceberg. But there was no sign of my father or of our little fishing sloop. The monster berg had recovered itself and, with its new balance, lifted its head perhaps 50 feet above the waves. On top of this island of ice was a plateau perhaps half an acre in extent. I loved my father well and was grief-stricken at the awfulness of his death. I railed at fate that I, too, had not been permitted to sleep with him in the depths of the ocean. Finally, I climbed to my feet and looked about me. The purple-domed sky above, the shoreless green ocean beneath, and only an occasional iceberg discernible. My heart sank in hopeless despair. I cautiously picked my way across the berg toward the other side, hoping that our fishing craft had righted itself. Dared I think it possible that my father still lived? There was but a ray of hope that flamed up in my heart, but the anticipation warmed my blood in my veins and started rushing like some rare stimulant through every fiber of my body. I crept close to the precipitous side of the iceberg and peered far down, hoping, still hoping. Then I made a circle of the berg, scanning every foot of the way, and thus I kept going around and around. One part of my brain was certainly becoming maniacal, while the other part, I believe, and do to this day, was perfectly rational. I was conscious of having made the circuit a dozen times, and while one part of my intelligence knew, in all reason, there was not a vestige of hope, yet some strange, fascinating aberration bewitched and compelled me still to beguile myself with expectation. The other part of my brain seemed to tell me that while there was no possibility of my father being alive, yet if I quit thinking the capricious pilgrimage, if I paused for a single moment, it would be acknowledgement of defeat, and should I do this, I felt that I should go mad. Thus, hour after hour, I walked around and around, afraid to stop and rest, yet physically powerless to continue much longer. Oh, horror of horrors, to be cast away in this wide expanse of waters without food or drink, only a treacherous iceberg for an abiding place. My heart sank within me, and all semblance of hope was fading into black despair. Then, the hand of the deliverer was extended, and the death-like stillness of a solitude rapidly becoming unbearable was suddenly broken by the firing of a signal gun. I looked up in startled amazement when I saw, less than a half a mile away, a whaling vessel bearing down toward me with her sail full set. Evidently, my continued activity on the iceberg had attracted their attention. On drawing near, they put out a boat and, descending cautiously to the water's edge, I was rescued, and a little later lifted on board the whaling ship. I found it was a Scotch whaler, the Arlington. She had cleared the Dundee in September and started immediately for the Antarctic in search of whales. The captain, Angus McPherson, seemed kindly disposed, but in matters of discipline, as I soon learned, possessed of an iron will. When I attempted to tell him that I had come from the inside of the earth, the captain and mate looked at each other, shook their heads, and insisted on my being put in a bunk under strict surveillance of the ship's position. I was very weak for want of food, and had not slept for many hours. However, after a few days' rest, I got up one morning and dressed myself without asking permission of the physician or anyone else, and told him that I was as sane as anyone. The captain sent for me, and again questioned me concerning where I had come from and how I came to be alone on an iceberg in the far-off Antarctic Ocean. I replied that I had just come from the inside of the earth, and to proceed to tell him how my father and myself had gone in by way of Spitzbergen and come out by way of the South Pole country. Whereupon I was put in irons. I afterward heard the captain tell the mate that I was as crazy as a March hare, and that I must remain in confinement until I was rational enough to give a truthful account of myself. Finally, after much pleading and many promises, I was released from irons. I then and there decided to invent some story that would satisfy the captain and never again refer to my trip to the island of the Smoky God, at least until I was safe among friends. Within a fortnight, I was permitted to go about and take my place as one of the seamen. A little later, the captain asked me for an explanation. I told him that my experience had been so horrible that I was fearful of my memory and begged him to permit me to leave the question unanswered until some time in the future. I think you are recovering considerably, he said, but you are not staying yet by a good deal. Permit me to do such work as you may assign, I replied. And if it does not compensate you sufficiently, I will pay you immediately after I reach Stockholm, to the last penny. Thus, the matter rested. On finally reaching Stockholm, as I have already related, I found that my good mother had gone to her reward more than a year before. I have also told how, later, the treachery of a relative landed me in a madhouse, where I remained for 28 years, seemingly unending years, and still later, after my release, how I returned to the life of a fisherman, following it sedulously for 27 years. Then how I came to America, and finally to Los Angeles, California. But all this can be of little interest to the reader. Indeed, it seems to me the climax of my wonderful travels and strange adventures was reached when the Scotch sailing vessel took me from an iceberg on the Antarctic Ocean. End of Part 5. Recorded by J. Sands. Part 6 of The Smoky God. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Sands. The Smoky God, or Voyage to the Inner World, by Willis George Emerson. Conclusion. In concluding this history of my adventures, I wish to state that I firmly believe science is yet in its infancy concerning the cosmology of the Earth. There is so much that is unaccounted for by the world's accepted knowledge of today, and will ever remain so until the land of the Smoky God is known and recognized by our geographers. It is the land from whence came the great logs of cedar that have been found by explorers in open waters far over the northern edge of the Earth's crust, and also the bodies of mammoths, whose bones are found in vast beds on the Siberian coast. Northern explorers have done much. Sir John Franklin, De Haven Griddle, Sir John Murray, Kane, Melville, Hall, Nansen, Schwatka, Greeley, Peary, Ross, Gerlach, Bernacchi, Andre, Amsden, Amundsen, and others have all been striving to form the frozen citadel of mystery. I believe firmly that Andre and his two brave companions, Strindberg and Frankel, who sailed away in the balloon Orion from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen on that Sunday afternoon of July 11, 1897, are now in the within world, and doubtless are being entertained, as my father and myself were entertained by the kind-hearted giant race inhabiting the inner Atlantic continent. Having, in my humble way, devoted years to these problems, I am well acquainted with the accepted definitions of gravity, as well as the cause of the magnetic needle's attraction, And I'm prepared to say that it is my firm belief that the magnetic needle is influenced solely by electric currents, which completely envelop the Earth like a garment, and that these electric currents in an endless circuit pass out of the southern end of the Earth's cylindrical opening, diffusing and spreading themselves over all the outside surface, and rushing madly on in their course toward the North Pole. And while these currents seemingly dash off into space at the Earth's curve or edge, yet they drop again to the inside surface and continue their way southward along the inside of the Earth's crust, toward the opening of the so-called South Pole. Note 24, quote, Mr. Lemstrom concluded that an electric discharge, which could only be seen by means of the spectroscope, was taking place on the surface of the ground all around him, and that from a distance it would appear as a faint display of aurora, the phenomenon of pale and flaming light which is sometimes seen on the top of the Spitzbergen Mountains. Unquote. From the Arctic Manual, page 739. As to gravity, no one knows what it is, because it has not yet been determined whether it is atmospheric pressure that causes the apple to fall, or whether 150 miles below the surface of the Earth, supposedly one halfway through the Earth's crust, there exists some powerful lodestone attraction that draws it. Therefore, whether the apple, when it leaves the limb of the tree, is drawn or impelled downward to the nearest point of resistance is unknown to the students of physics. Sir James Ross claimed to have discovered the magnetic pole at about 74 degrees latitude. This is wrong. The magnetic pole is exactly one half the distance through the Earth's crust. Thus, if the Earth's crust is 300 miles in thickness, which is the distance I estimate it to be, then the magnetic pole is undoubtedly 150 miles below the surface of the Earth. It matters not where the test is made. And at this particular point, 150 miles below the surface, gravity ceases, becomes neutralized. And when we pass beyond that point on toward the inside surface of the Earth, a reverse attraction geometrically increases in power until the other 150 miles of distance is traversed, which would bring us out on the inside of the Earth. Thus, if a hole were bored down through the Earth's crust at London, Paris, New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, a distance of 300 miles, it would connect the two surfaces, while the inertia and momentum of weight dropped in from the outside surface would carry it far past the magnetic center. Yet, before reaching the inside surface of the Earth, it would gradually diminish in speed after passing the halfway point, finally pause and immediately fall back toward the outside surface, and continue thus to oscillate like the swinging of a pendulum with the power removed, until it would finally rest at the magnetic center, or at that particular point exactly one half the distance between the outside surface and the inside surface of the Earth. The gyration of the Earth in its daily act of whirling around in its spiral rotation at a rate greater than 1,000 miles every hour, or about 17 miles per second, makes of it a vast electro-generating body, a huge machine, a mighty prototype of the puny man-made dynamo, which, at best, is but a feeble imitation of nature's original. The valleys of this inner Atlantis continent, bordering the upper waters of the farthest north, are in season covered with the most magnificent and luxuriant flowers, not hundreds and thousands, but millions of acres, from which the pollen or blossom are carried far away in most every direction by the Earth's spiral gyrations and the agitation of the wind resulting therefrom. And it is these blossoms or pollen from the vast floral meadows within that produce the colored snows of the Arctic regions that have so mystified the northern explorers. Note 25, King, Volume 1, page 44 says, quote, we passed the crimson cliffs of Sir John Ross in the forenoon of August 5th. The patches of red snow from which they derived their name could be seen clearly at the distance of 10 miles from the coast, unquote. La Chambre, in an account of André's balloon expedition on page 144, says, quote, "On the Isle of Amsterdam, the snow is tinted with red for a considerable distance, and the savants are collecting it to examine it microscopically. It presents, in fact, certain peculiarities. It is thought that it contains very small plants. Scoresby, the famous whaler, had already remarked this." Unquote. Beyond question, this new land within is the home, the cradle of the human race, and viewed from the standpoint of the discoveries made by us, must of necessity have a most important bearing on all physical, paleontological, archaeological, philological, and mythological theories of antiquity. The same idea of going back to the land of mystery, to the very beginning, to the origin of man, is found in the Egyptian traditions of the earlier terrestrial regions of the gods, heroes and men, from the historical fragments of Manetho, fully verified by the historical records taken from the more recent excavations of Pompeii, as well as the traditions of the North American Indians. It is now 1 hour past midnight. The new year of 1908 is here, and this is the third day thereof. And having at last finished the record of my strange travels and adventures I wish given to the world, I am ready, and even longing, for the peaceful rest which I am sure will follow life's trials and vicissitudes. I am old in years, and ripe both with adventures and sorrows, yet rich with the few friends I have cemented to me in my struggles to lead a just and upright life. Like a story that is, well nigh told, my life is ebbing away. The presentiment is strong within me that I shall not live to see the rising of another sun. Thus do I conclude my message. Olaf Jensen. End of part 6. Recorded by J. Sands. Part 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recordings by J. Sands. The Smoky God, or Voyage to the Inner World by Willis George Emerson. Author's foreword. I found much difficulty in deciphering and editing the manuscripts of Olaf Jansen. However, I have taken the liberty of reconstructing only a very few expressions, and in doing this have in no way changed the spirit or meaning. Otherwise, the original text has neither been added to nor taken from. It is impossible for me to express my opinion as to the value or reliability of the wonderful statements made by Olaf Jansen. The description here given of the strange lands and people visited by him, locations of cities, the names and directions of rivers, and other information herein combined, conform in every way to the rough drawings given into my custody by this ancient Norseman, which drawings, together with the manuscript, it is my intention at some later date to give to the Smithsonian Institution, to preserve for the benefit of those interested in the mysteries of the farthest north, the frozen circle of silence. It is certain there are many things in Vedic literature, in Joseph's, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Terrien de la Coupiere's early history of Chinese civilization, Flammarion's astronomical myths, the Normant's beginning of history, Hesiod's Theogony, Sir John de Monteville's writings, and Sayce's records of the past, that, to say the least, are strangely in harmony with the seemingly incredible text found in the yellow manuscript of the Old Norseman Olaf Jansen. And now, for the first time, given to the world. The end. The End of the Smoky God, or Voyage to the Inner World, by Willis George Emerson. Read by Jay Sands. To John Barrow, Bart, FRS, in his work entitled Voyages of Discovery and Research within the Arctic Regions, quote-unquote, says on page 57, quote, Mr. Beachley refers to what was frequently been found and noticed, the mildness of the temperature on the western coast of Spitsbergen, there being little or no sensation of cold, though the thermometer might be only a few degrees above the freezing point. The brilliant and lively effect of a clear day, when the sun shines forth with a pure sky, whose azure hue is so intense as to find no parallel, even in the boasted Italian sky. On the east coast, there was numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still farther to the westward, the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us, and directly to the north, lay an open sea. Note 4. Captain Kane, on page 299, quoting from Morton's journal on Monday, the 26th of December, says, quote, As far as I could see, the open passages were 15 miles or more wide, with sometimes mashed ice separating them, but it is all small ice, and I think it either drives out to the open space to the north, or rots and sinks, as I could see none ahead to the north. Unquote. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, and had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, my father explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than any that mortal man had ever known, and that it was inhabited by the chosen. Note 5. We find the following in Deutsche Mythology, page 778, from the pen of Jacob Grimm. Quote, Then the sons of Bor built in the middle of the universe the city called Asgard, where dwell the gods and their kindred, and from that abode work out so many wondrous things both on the earth and in the heavens above it. There is in that city a place called Klinskov, and when Odin is seated there upon his lofty throne, he sees over the whole world and discerns all the actions of men. Unquote. My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, Why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind is favorable, and the sea is open. Even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance as he turned toward me and asked, My son, are you willing to go with me and explore, to go far beyond where man has ever ventured? I answered affirmatively. Very well, he replied. May the god Odin protect us. And quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass, turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage began. Note 6. Hall writes on page 288,
Right.
quote, On the 23rd of January, the two Esquimaux
Weird.
accompanied...
It was a weird book. Man, it's got an hour and a half of notes. That's really weird. This guy's got lots of weird books on his page. How to use your secret mind power. Native American mythology. Old Indian legends. Freemasonry by Manly P. Hall. Interesting. Let's find a short one. I'm not so sure about the inner earth.
Section 1 of How to Tell a Story and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Salto. How to Tell a Story and Other Essays by Mark Twain. Section 1. How to Tell a Story. The humorous story and American development, its difference from comic and witty stories. I do not claim that I can tell a story as it ought to be told. I only claim to know how a story ought to be told, for I have been almost daily in the company of the most expert storytellers for many years. There are several kinds of stories, but only one difficult kind, the humorous. I will talk mainly about that one. The humorous story is American. The comic story is English. The witty story is French. The humorous story depends for its effect upon the manner of the telling. The comic story and the witty story upon the matter. The humorous story may be spun out to great lengths and may wander around as much as it pleases and arrive nowhere in particular. But the comic and witty stories must be brief and end with a point. The humorous story bubbles gently along, the others burst. The humorous story is strictly a work of art. High and delicate art, and only an artist can tell it. But no art is necessary in telling the comic and the witty story. Anybody can do it. The art of telling a humorous story, understand, I mean by word of mouth, not print, was created in America and has remained at home. The humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects that there is anything funny about it. But the teller of the comic story tells you beforehand that it's one of the funniest things he has ever heard, then tells it with eager delight, and is the first person to laugh when he gets through. And sometimes, if he has had good success, he is so glad and happy that he will repeat the nub of it and glance around from face to face, collecting applause, and then repeat it again. It is a pathetic thing to see. Very often, of course, the rambling and disjointed humorous story finishes with a nub, point, snapper, or whatever you like to call it. Then the listener must be alert, for in many cases the teller will divert attention from that nub by dropping it in a carefully casual and indifferent way, with a pretense that he does not know it is a nub. Artemis Ward used that trick a good deal. Then, when the belated audience presently caught the joke, he would look up with innocent surprise, as if wondering what they had found to laugh at. Dan Satchel used it before him. Nye and Riley and others use it today. But the teller of the comic story does not slur the nub. He shouts it at you every time. And when he prints it in England, France, Germany, and Italy, he italicizes it, puts some whooping exclamation points after it, and sometimes explains it in a parenthesis. All of which is very depressing and makes one want to renounce joking and lead a better life. Let me set down an instance of the comic method, using an anecdote which has been popular all over the world for 12 or 1500 years. The teller tells it in this way. The wounded soldier. In the course of a certain battle, a soldier whose leg had been shot off appealed to another soldier who was hurrying by to carry him to the rear, informing him at the same time of the loss which he had sustained, whereupon the generous son of Mars, shouldering the unfortunate, proceeded to carry out his desire. The bullets and cannonballs were flying in all directions, and presently one of the latter took the wounded man's head off, without, however, his deliverer being aware of it. In no long time he was hailed by an officer who said, "Where are you going with that carcass?" "To the rear, sir. He's lost his leg." "His leg, forsooth," responded the astonished officer. "You mean his head, you booby." Whereupon the soldier dispossessed himself of his burden and stood looking down upon it in great perplexity. At length he said, "It is true, sir, just as you have said." Then, after a pause, he added, "But he told me it was his leg." Here the narrator bursts into explosion after explosion of thunderous horse laughter, repeating that nub from time to time through his gaspings and shriekings and suffocatings. It takes only a minute and a half to tell that in its comic story form, and isn't worth the telling after all. Put into the humorous story form, it takes 10 minutes and is about the funniest thing I have ever listened to, as James Whitcomb Riley tells it. He tells it in the character of a dull-witted old farmer who has just heard it for the first time, thinks it is unspeakably funny, and is trying to repeat it to a neighbor. But he can't remember it, so he gets all mixed up and wanders helplessly round and round, putting in tedious details that don't belong in the tale and only retard it, taking them out conscientiously and putting in others that are just as useless, making minor mistakes, now and then stopping to correct them and explain how he came to make them, remembering things which he forgot to put in their proper place and going back to put them in there, stopping his narrative a good while in order to try to recall the name of the soldier that was hurt, and finally remembering that the soldier's name was not mentioned, and remarking placidly that the name is of no real importance anyway. Better, of course, if one knew it, but not essential after all. And so on, and so on, and so on. The teller is innocent and happy and pleased with himself, and has to stop every little while to hold himself in and keep from laughing outright, and does hold in, but his body quakes in a jelly-like way with interior chuckles. And at the end of the 10 minutes, the audience have laughed until they are exhausted and the tears are running down their faces. The simplicity and innocence and sincerity and unconsciousness of the old farmer are perfectly simulated, and the result is a performance which is thoroughly charming and delicious. This is art, and fine and beautiful, and only a master can compass it, but a machine could tell the other story. To string incongruities and absurdities together in a wandering and sometimes purposeless way, and seem innocently unaware that they are absurdities, is the basis of the American art, if my position is correct. Another feature is the slurring of the point. The third is the dropping of a studied remark, apparently without knowing it, as if one were thinking aloud. The fourth and last is the pause. Artemus Ward dealt in numbers 3 and 4 a good deal. He would begin to tell with great animation something which he seemed to think was wonderful, then lose confidence, and after an apparently absent-minded pause, add an incongruous remark in a soliloquizing way. And that was the remark intended to explode the mine, and it did. For instance, he would say eagerly, excitedly, "I once knew a man in New Zealand who had a tooth in his head." Here his animation would die out. A silent, reflective pause would follow. Then he would say dreamily and as if to himself, "And yet that man could beat a drum better than any man I ever saw." The pause is an exceedingly important feature in any kind of story, and a frequently recurring feature too. It is a dainty thing and delicate and also uncertain and treacherous, for it must be exactly the right length, no more and no less, or it fails of its purpose and makes trouble. If the pause is too short, the impressive point is past, and if too long, the audience have had time to divine that a surprise is intended, and then you can't surprise them, of course. On the platform, I used to tell a Negro ghost story that had a pause in front of the snapper on the end. And that pause was the most important thing in the whole story. If I got it the right length precisely, I could spring the finishing ejaculation with effect enough to make some impressible girl deliver a startled little yelp and jump out of her seat. And that was what I was after. This story was called The Golden Arm and was told in this fashion. You can practice with it yourself, and mind you look out for the pause and get it right. The Golden Arm. Once upon a time there was a monstrous mean man, and he lived way out in the prairie, all alone by himself, excepting he had a wife. And by she died, and he took and toted her way out there in the prairie and buried her. Well, she had a golden arm, all solid gold from the shoulder down. He was powerful, powerful, and that night he couldn't sleep. Guess he want that golden arm so bad. When it come midnight, he couldn't stand it no more. So he get up, he did, and took his lantern and shoved out through the storm and dug her up and got the golden arm. And he bent his head down in the wind and plowed and plowed and plowed through the snow. Then all on a sudden he stopped, make a considerable pause here and look startled and take a listening attitude and say, "My land, what's that?" And he listen and listen, and the wind say, "Set your teeth together and imitate the wailing and wheezing sing-song of the wind. Bzzz. And then, way back yonder, where the grave is, he hear a voice. He hear a voice all mixed up in the wind, can't hardly tell 'em apart. Zzz. Who got my golden arm? Zzz. Who got my golden arm? You must begin to shiver violently now. And he began to shiver and shake and say, oh my land." And the wind blow the lantern out, and the snow and sleet blow in his face and most choke him, and he started plowing knee deep towards home most dead. He's so scared. And pretty soon he heard their voice again, and pause. It is coming after him. Bzzz. Who got my golden arm? When he gets to the pasture, he hear it again, closer now, in a coming back down in the dark, in the storm. Repeat the wind and the voice. When he gets to the house, he rush upstairs and jump in the bed and kiver up, head and ears, and lay down shivering and shaking. And then way out there he hear it again, and a coming. And by me by he hear, pause, odd listening attitude. Pat, pat, pat. It's a coming upstairs. Then he hear the latch, and he know it's in the room. Then pretty soon he know it's a standing by the bed. Pause. Then he know it's a bending down over him, and he can scarcely get his breath. Then he seemed to feel something cold right down most again his head. Pause. Then the voice say right at his ear, who got my golden arm? You must wail it out very plaintively and accusingly. Then you stare steadily and impressively into the face of the farthest gone auditor, a girl preferably, and let that awe-inspiring pause begin to build itself in the deep hush. When it has reached exactly the right length, jump suddenly at that girl and yell, "You've got it!" If you've got the pause right, she fetch a dear little yelp and spring right out of her shoes. But you must get the pause right, and you will find it the most troublesome and aggravating and uncertain thing you ever undertook. End of section 1. Section 2 of How to Tell a Story and Other Essays by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mental telegraphy again. I have 3 or 4 curious incidents to tell about. They seem to come under the head of what I named mental telegraphy in a paper written 17 years ago and published long afterwards. The paper entitled Mental Telegraphy, which originally appeared in Harper's Magazine for December 1893, is included in the volume entitled The American Claimant and Other Stories and Sketches. Several years ago, I made a campaign on the platform with Mr. George W. Cable. In Montreal, we were honored with a reception. It began at 2 in the afternoon in a long drawing room in the Windsor Hotel. Mr. Cable and I stood at one end of this room, and the ladies and gentlemen entered each at the other end, crossed each at that end, then came up the long left-hand side, shook hands with us, said a word or two, and passed on in the usual way. My sight is of the telescopic sort, and I presently recognized a familiar face among the throng of strangers drifting in at the distant door, and I said to myself with surprise and high gratification, "That is Mrs. R." I had forgotten that she was a Canadian. She had been a great friend of mine in Carson City, Nevada, in the early days. I had not seen her or heard of her for 20 years. I had not been thinking about her. There was nothing to suggest her to me, nothing to bring her to my mind. In fact, to me, she had long ago ceased to exist and had disappeared from my consciousness. But I knew her instantly, and I saw her so clearly that I was able to note some of the particulars of her dress, and did note them, and they remained in my mind. I was impatient for her to come. In the midst of the handshakings, I snatched glimpses of her and noted her progress with a slow-moving file across the end of the room. Then I saw her start up the side, and this gave me a full front view of her face. I saw her last when she was within 25 feet of me. For an hour, I kept thinking she must still be in the room somewhere and would come at last, but I was disappointed. When I arrived in the lecture hall that evening, someone said, "Come into the waiting room. There's a friend of yours there who wants to see you. You'll not be introduced. You are to do the recognizing without help, if you can." I said to myself, "It is Mrs. R. I shan't have any trouble." There were perhaps 10 ladies present, all seated. In the midst of them was Mrs. R., as I had expected. She was dressed exactly as she was when I had seen her in the afternoon. I went forward and shook hands with her and called her by name and said, "I knew you the moment you appeared at the reception this afternoon." She looked surprised and said, "But I was not at the reception. I have just arrived from Quebec and have not been in town an hour." It was my turn to be surprised now. I said, "I can't help it. I give you my word of honor that it is as I say. I saw you at the reception, and you were dressed precisely as you are now. When they told me a moment ago that I should find a friend in this room, your image rose before me, dress and all, just as I had seen you at the reception. Those are the facts." She was not at the reception at all, or anywhere near it, but I saw her there nevertheless, and most clearly and unmistakably. To that I could make oath. How is one to explain this? I was not thinking of her at the time, had not thought of her for years, but she had been thinking of me, no doubt. Did her thoughts flit through leagues of air to me and bring with it that clear and pleasant vision of herself? I think so. That was and remains my sole experience in the matter of apparitions. I mean, apparitions that come when one is ostensibly awake. I could have been asleep for a moment. The apparition could have been the creature of a dream. Still, that is nothing to the point. The feature of interest is the happening of the thing just at that time instead of at an earlier or later time, which is argument that its origin lay in thought transference. My next incident will be set aside by most persons as being merely a coincidence, I suppose. Years ago, I used to think sometimes of making a lecturing trip through the Antipodes and the borders of the Orient, but always gave up the idea, partly because of the great length of the journey and partly because my wife could not well manage to go with me. Towards the end of last January, that idea, after an interval of years, came suddenly into my head again, forcefully too, and without any apparent reason. Whence came it? What suggested it? I will touch upon that presently. I was at that time where I am now, in Paris. I wrote at once to Henry M. Stanley, London, and asked him some questions about his Australian lecture tour and inquired who had conducted him and what were the terms. After a day or two, his answer came. It began, "The lecture agent for Australia and New Zealand is par excellence Mr. R. S. Smythe of Melbourne." He added his itinerary, terms, sea expenses, and some other matters, and advised me to write Mr. Smythe, which I did, February 3rd. I began my letter by saying in substance that while he did not know me personally, we had a mutual friend in Stanley, and that would answer for an introduction. Then I proposed my trip and asked if he would give me the same terms which he had given Stanley. I mailed my letter to Mr. Smythe February 6th, and 3 days later I got a letter from the self-same Smythe, dated Melbourne, December 17th. I would as soon have expected to get a letter from the late George Washington. The letter began somewhat as mine to him had begun, with a self-introduction. "Dear Mr. Clemens, it is so long since Archibald Forbes and I spent that pleasant afternoon in your comfortable house at Hartford that you have probably quite forgotten the occasion." In the course of his letter, this occurs: "I am willing to give you," here he named the terms which he had given Stanley, "for an Antipodean tour to last, say, 3 months." Here was the single essential detail of my letter answered 3 days after I had mailed my inquiry. I might have saved myself the trouble and the postage, and a few years ago I would have done that very thing, for I would have argued that my sudden and strong impulse to write and ask some questions of a stranger on the other side of the globe meant that the impulse came from that stranger, and that he would answer my questions of his own motion if I would let him alone. Mr. Smythe's letter probably passed under my nose on its way to lose 3 weeks traveling to America and back, and gave me a whiff of its content as it went along. Letters often act like that. Instead of the thought coming to you in an instant from Australia, the apparently unsentient letter imparts it to you as it glides invisibly past your elbow in the mailbag. Next incident. In the following month, March, I was in America. I spent a Sunday at Irvington on the Hudson with Mr. John Brisbane Walker of the Cosmopolitan magazine. We came into New York next morning and went to the Century Club for luncheon. He said some praiseful things about the character of the club and the orderly serenity and pleasantness of its quarters, and asked if I had never tried to acquire membership in it. I said I had not, and that New York clubs were a continuous expense to the country members without being of frequent use or benefit to them. And now I've got an idea, said I. There's the Lotus, the first New York club I was ever a member of, my very earliest love in that line. I have been a member of it for considerably more than 20 years, yet have seldom had a chance to look in and see the boys. They turn grey and grow old while I am not watching, and my dues go on. I am going to Hartford this afternoon for a day or two, but as soon as I get back, I will go to John Elderkin very privately and say, remember the veteran and confer distinction upon him for the sake of old times. Make me an honorary member and abolish the tax. If you haven't any such thing as honorary membership, all the better. Create it for my honor and glory. That would be a great thing. I will go to John Elderkin as soon as I get back from Hartford. I took the last express that afternoon, first telegraphing Mr. F.G. Osborne to come and see me next day. When he came, he asked, did you get a letter from Mr. John Elderkin, secretary of the Lotus Club, before you left New York? Then it just missed you. If I had known you were coming, I would have kept it. It is beautiful and will make you proud. The board of directors, by unanimous vote, have made you a life member and scratched those dues. And you are to be on hand and receive your distinction on the night of the 30th, which is the 25th anniversary of the founding of the club. And it will not surprise me if they have some great times there. What put the honorary membership in my head that day in the Century Club? For I had never thought of it before. I don't know what brought the thought to me at that particular time instead of earlier, but I am well satisfied that it originated with the board of directors and had been on its way to my brain through the air even since the moment that saw their vote recorded. Another incident. I was in Hartford 2 or 3 days as a guest of the Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell. I have held the rank of honorary uncle to his children for a quarter of a century, and I went out with him in the trolley car to visit one of my nieces, who is at Miss Porter's famous school in Farmington. The distance is 8 or 9 miles. On the way, talking, I illustrated something with an anecdote. This is the anecdote. 2 years and a half ago, I and the family arrived at Milan on our way to Rome and stopped at the Continental. After dinner, I went below and took a seat in the stone-paved court where the customary lemon trees stand in the customary tubs, and said to myself, now this is comfort and repose, and nobody to disturb it. I don't know anybody in Milan. Then a young gentleman stepped up and shook hands, which damaged my theory. He said, in substance, you won't remember me, Mr. Clemens, but I remember you very well. I was a cadet at West Point when you and Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell came there some years ago and talked to us on 100th night. I am a lieutenant in the regular army now, and my name is H. I am in Europe all alone for a modest little tour.
Adios.